how would you describe, what the last 3 years have been like for you? Because I think regardless of your political opinions, everyone had to do a little bit of reassessment after 2020. So I'm curious, what was the pandemic and kind of the fiery but peaceful summer of love? Like, how did you change over the course of those events?
Change. That's interesting. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind is just my style of communication changed when the pandemic, or when the response to the pandemic hit, the lockdowns and whatnot. I was kind of already living in that didn't terribly affect me. I did lose some hours at my day job, but we kind of just rolled with it, and I found other work to do. And I just kept on producing content because I'm what Mary Harrington calls of the laptop class. And so I was kind of basically hyper online anyways. But when the lead up to the George Floyd events, I saw that the value of life wasn't sufficient for our nation, right? So the value, we did all these really big discussion or choices with our lockdowns and prioritizing education, prioritizing businesses to save life, prioritizing everybody for the sake of the elderly. And that was centered around like a no harm, avoidance of death. So death was kind of the paradigm, and a lot of people were obsessed with fear, and you see that playing out. There was a lot of neuroticism that was engaged in, and then there was a lot of authoritarianism that came in, depending on what state you're in. It was more authoritarian, or country more authoritarian than other places. But what I saw leading up to George Floyd was it wasn't enough. Like, we needed a bigger crisis than that. And I remember, so I'm terminally online, so I'm always kind of watching what Twitter is doing, and kind of having a relationship between what Twitter is doing and all the chaos on Twitter, and then my own sense of agency and my own sense of integrity and sovereignty, and just trying to manage that relationship between that stimulus and my own internal state. But there was this dog park woman. This woman was walking a dog, and this footage of this guy where she threatened to call the cops on him. And he was like, "This is a racist thing. You want to call cops on a black man," and that footage went out. And this was after, and you saw this already before the pandemic with the Jussie Smollett event, and with that Nick Sandman thing, the guy that was being yelled at by the Indian elder guy, if you guys remember that Covington kids thing. So you saw this certain class of people really itching for justice, really itching for social justice. And the rhetoric wasn't as crude as it was at Evergreen, but I noticed that in the case of Evergreen and in the case of other college activisms that had happened previous to the George Floyd event, it's like they have everything in place to panic. They have everything in place to have a revolution. They just need that spark. They need that one straw to break the camel's back, and they're looking for it constantly. I don't know if they're looking for it so much anymore, but they were really looking for it then. And with that dog park woman, I saw them try to make that thing happen, and then the George Floyd thing happens, and it's perfect. It's so symbolic. It's a literal martyrdom, and they have everything they need. And all of that rhetoric, all that anti-racist rhetoric was waiting for this to happen. So it swooped right in. And then all of that pent-up energy, just at like what happened at Evergreen, a lot of what fueled the insanity at Evergreen was that those kids were not suited to be at a college, and they had been cooped up all winter long, and they needed just have a jubilee. They just needed a jubilee, and they needed a reason for a jubilee. And the same thing happened in like across the world. For some reason, America sneezed and the rest of the world got the flu. Well, technically China sneezed first, but that's neither here nor there. And then I just went into panic mode, because the whole thing was happening. The same thing that was happening at Evergreen was happening across Washington, and all over Portland, and all over the world. And I was just shocked. I went into a panic. It was like a very PTSD moment for me. I'm not a fan of that, and that was one of the few moments in my life where I actually did have some like hyper anxiety, like a lot of stress, and I tried to talk my way through it. I just kind of tried to talk my way through it. And by that time, I had kind of switched from doing punditry or journalism, internet journalism through YouTube. And I relied at that point, I switched more to an interview format. And so I just had a lot of discussions and we talked through a lot of that stuff from various different points of view. But I guess in how my thought has changed or how my perspective has changed is to become very, even though I am a liberal in the way that I behave and in the values that I live, and by liberal, I mean a deep sense of respect of each other's property, a deep sense of freedom of speech, and a heavy emphasis on argumentation and rationality and good faith argument. I am that in my core. But that set of beliefs and that set of behaviors is not sufficient to combat or to navigate through periods of very high stress. And so I've become, even though I don't know how to go back from being liberal in deed and liberal at heart. I'm deeply, deeply skeptical of the liberal project. And so a lot of the work that I've been trying to do over the past year specifically, and maybe a couple years, is to try to find, try to trace the problem with what is called wokeness into the liberal project, see how it's related, if it's a parasite on that, or if it's the spawn of that, and then what other alternative modes of social governance and social behavior is proper for this post-liberal age. And it's post-liberal because the woke and postmodernism is ascendant. So I don't know if there can be a liberalism without something that supports liberalism. And from my point of view, it's Christian values that led to liberalism. So somehow getting back to those Christian values and rooting, whatever that means, like rooting those liberal values into something even more primordial, more mythic, and perhaps more spiritual, if you'll forgive that particular phrase, trying to figure out how we can cement that. So that's kind of my path forward.
So that's interesting. And when you and I were speaking in Twitter DMs, if you can call that speaking, you sent me a photo of, and it was a meme, right? Of I believe it was Mel Gibson reading Unqualified Reservations.
Yeah, I have
and
it
to me, is that the hardcover copy of it?
Yeah, I
need to pick one of those up.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, that's a beautiful copy.
It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous.
So I was lucky enough to be given Unqualified Reservations at a relatively young age.
Oh,
I have a lifelong friend, actually when I was probably 15 or 16. I had an original UR reader who was a teacher of mine who slipped me a copy. And of course, it all went over my head. But it was important to me, right? It was something that kind of I came back to later in life. And listening to you speak about this, about how kind of like in your heart and in your soul, you're still liberal, is something that sort of resonates with me. I would say less so, by temperament. But there's a part in Moldbug, and I can't remember if it's in, what part of UR it's in. But he basically is talking to an imaginary libertarian, or maybe it was a real libertarian, I can't remember. And he basically says, look, the libertarian and the fascist actually both agree on what the ideal society is. A society in which there is spontaneous order, right? Where you don't necessarily need, a bunch of jackbooted thugs to make sure that you can, wander through your wheat fields with your flower dresses on. But the problem is, and of course I'm speaking hyperbolically, right?
Oh, no, I was thinking Midsummer now. Who's going to get sacrificed at the end of your little metaphor here?
That's not necessarily where I was going, but maybe someone wants that. But nonetheless, right? The problem is, and I think that this is a core flaw in, classical liberalism, is how do you get to that ideal state of spontaneous order? Where things work without, you needing to be there with your hand on the wheel, right? Without you needing, a kind of an explicit force there. And so to me, when I look at the liberal project and see the things in it that resonate with me. It's that kind of end state. But the problem is, you don't get to that end state by merely, removing all of the bones, removing all of the ways force can be brought to bear, right? That's the end state. That's not how you get there. It's similar to describing, well, how do you teach your kid to ride a bike? Well, you don't do it by, putting them on a bike. You do it by putting them on a bike with training wheels. There needs to be some sort of structure to it. And so when you're talking about kind of like the rooting of liberalism, the things that brought that forth, I don't know, that's interesting to me. And so I'm curious, right? One of the things that and I don't mean to bring up DMs, but you mentioned, that you were keeping Ramadan, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, because that's kind of that's something I wouldn't have expected. So is that a way in which you're kind of connecting yourself to a deeper, older spiritual tradition, or is that just kind of something else?
Not tradition, but state. State. I think it was yesterday. Yesterday, I had a dream where I had a dream. So we're about, I think, 12 days into Ramadan. So I'm over like the terrible part, like where my body's just purging and aching and hungry all the time. And now I'm just kind of in the rhythm of the month. It's a 30-day practice, and it's just sun up to sundown. It's pretty easy for a fast. And it's on the lunar cycle. So every year it's like 15 days adjusted previous than the year before. And I usually, once I get into the practice of it, I start to become more clear and more quiet. And I had this dream yesterday that I was sitting in a room somewhere in like an office or at my job. And I'm like, I'm not thinking at all. My brain is totally quiet. And I was kind of anxious about that. I'm like, my brain's quiet. Like, I'm not thinking. Like, who am I if I'm not thinking? Who am I if I'm not thinking? And I'm like, well, I just am. And it was worrisome. But then when I thought about it and I recalled the dream, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm getting quiet. That's why I do Ramadan. I do Ramadan to get quiet, because through my life, I ingest tons and tons of stimuli. And that stimuli is everything from food to media to all the different ways that I need to interact with the world in order to make a living, which is using my passions, which is using my anger and my greed and my lust and all those things that taken to extreme are deadly sins, but that without, I can't be the animal that I am. And if I'm not an animal, I'm not alive, right? So I have to be engaged with that stuff that in the Christian in a certain way of speaking through Christian tradition is kind of the sinful parts of life. And in Ramadan, I'm given a chance to abstain from that. And in abstaining from that, I'm given a chance to see myself without that, see myself and see my life without using those intermediary kind of helpers that I have, my greed and my lust and my anger and my rage and my ambition and my gossip and my judgmentalness of other people. So taking a break from that allows me to see something prior to that. So there is a tradition there, but what I'm trying to get is to a place before me, like a previous me, or the ground of my being, and to touch that once a year has been very beneficial for me over the, I guess, 22 years or so that I've been attempting to do Ramadan. If that answers the question.
That's interesting, because there is, and this is throughout, I'm using tradition in the most general sense, but a multitude of civilizations have kind of arrived at fasting as a way to connect to something kind of like outside of your, libidinal urges, right? So I'm currently in kind of like the last week of Lent, which is a Christian time of fasting. Obviously, various Eastern traditions had this. And there is something about it in which, somewhat paradoxically, much like, the earlier conversation, about liberalism, there is sort of you sort of gain a freedom through restraint in a way that you sort of have to sort of kill yourself to live in a weird way, to adopt a more explicitly Christian framework, where it's like you, in order to be a truly free man, you don't become truly free by indulgence, to adopt kind of an Augustinian framework, becoming a slave to your lusts. Well, you become free through self-control, which is an odd paradox. And I think that paradox doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue. It's just one of those kind of core tensions in the human experience. Do you see what I'm kind of getting at there?
Yeah, well, in a way, to use the Christian parable of, I don't know where exactly it is, but there's this image of man as the gardener, right? So God creates and then gives to man the world, and man's job is to organize the world. Man's job is to be the manager of the world. And the man needs to, it's a total Peterson moment, the man needs to organize himself. And what that is not just his room and the messiness of his room, but the messiness within his heart, the messiness within his mind. And cleaning that up or training that means that instead of being driven by my mind, I drive my mind. Instead of like my mind telling me what to do and telling me what to think, I use my mind when it's time to think. And then I perceive what my mind is doing. But if I'm always in my head, that means that I'm not even aware of what my head is doing. My head is me. Same thing with any of those libidinal urges. And so there's stacks and stacks of these libidinal urges, all the way up to a very fine sense of intuition, of a desire for worship is even, I would say, a passion. Like the desire to believe is a very noble passion. But if one is controlled by the belief and not really using that belief to become aware of themselves in the world, and using that belief or allowing that belief to facilitate a growing into being, if your being stops at belief, you're still distanced from being. Just if your being stops at the sexual urge, you're stopped from being. So yeah, that restraint, in an explicit way, discipline, restraint, it is killing. In a way, there is this kind of death to that, but it's more of a separation. In that surrender, that separation occurs, and in that separation, there's calmness and quiet, and then there's the possibility of something that I like to call grace. There's this possibility of sensing something that is the spiritual life, that is the ground floor of being. You can maybe every once in a while somebody will have an epiphany or some sort of revelation, spiritual experience, where that ground of being kind of punches through them. But at the same time, if you prepare the ground for that, the likelihood of you receiving a grace or a gift from something higher or a change in your nature, if you're already in a practice state of being ready for that, not even asking for it, just being ready for that, then that seed, so to speak, can really take root in you. So that discipline allows us to control ourselves and then be open to being perfected, to participating in our own perfection. This got kind of spiritual, didn't it?
It did, and it wasn't where I was guessing where it was going, but I'm fully happy to go there to kind of put on my Peterson hat and go back into Genesis. This reminds me very much of, the relationship between God and man, right? Like when we say that, man is made in the image of God, we obviously don't mean that there is a giant featherless bipod out there in the universe. But we do mean that we kind of share diminished aspects of God, right? So in Genesis, right, we see God making order out of chaos. Right, like the way that the creation is, or the way that the order of the universe is described before creation, right, is kind of this dark, roiling ocean. God creates order out of that, and so what is given to man as his charge, right? It's not the same level, the same power that God has to create something ex nihilo out of nothing. Well, it's to order creation, right, by naming it, and so there is something which I guess is an oddly postmodern idea that you sort of can order something, you make it what it is by its name. And this is an idea that you see in lots of, kind of like 70s high fantasy, right? The idea that once you have the devil's name, you control it. Yeah. And I think that, even in kind of those, like, shall we say, less than serious sources, that is a deeply kind of true part of what it is to be human, so to speak. Do you get what I'm kind of poking around
Yeah,
there?
I would caution you to say that fantasy is less serious or less than serious. I think that's some of the more serious stuff there is. Proper fantasy, proper mythology, but that's a very small point. I think you get what you're
Right. I was probably referring more to like the kind of like crappy,
saying. Last
pulp novels I
Unicorn.
read as
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
stuff like
okay.
that. I read when I was 13, but
Yeah,
I was more
yeah. Dragon Slayer, something like that. Yeah, yeah.
And then that actually brings us back to Moldbug again, right? Which when Moldbug is basically describing like, well, what is good and evil? He views, and I realize that this may not be, universal opinion. He views order as synonymous with good. That essentially, and he has a famous essay essentially attacking the D&D alignment chart. And his point is essentially,
Oh
the
yeah, yeah.
idea that order and chaos and good and evil can be separated is fictitious. And sorry, I'm not trying to just bombard you with Moldbug, but he's
No,
a,
that's
a
fine. That's
thinker that's
fine.
been influential on me.
Yeah.
And again, this is not necessarily me trying to grill you. It's just the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, there was this. So in the unqualified reservation, which you can get on Passage Press, I think it's or Passage Publishing. It's a little expensive, but it's very well done. It's worth it. Mulbug or Yarvin writes an introduction to the thing, which tells the story of how he came up with these ideas. And there's just one line that stuck out with me. I don't like reading on stream, but I'll just read this. For me, quoting Yarvin, for me, the inside of that... okay, so he's making an argument that the Overton window is not a window, it's an electric fence, and that because we're social creatures, we always have to be in some sort of consensus reality. And so the liberal project of progressivism is our consensus reality, whether we like it or not. We can be against it or for it, but it's really difficult. We're always constantly policing ourselves. To stay in this. And he says that the Enlightenment is basically that Overton window. So for me, quoting him, the inside of that fence was the so-called Enlightenment and its revolutions. Of course, I admitted that the French Revolution had gone wrong, that its vision of liberty was a leftist vision of chaotic license, not a rightist vision of spontaneous order. I could see even how anarchy led ineluctably to tyranny, but walk wherever I would, I was always within the fence. So I'm wrestling with that idea of spontaneous order, and I think you kind of hit a critique in that, and the liberal desire for this world without entropy, where there's just some sort of blessed oil that coats everything, and there's this frictionless, spontaneous order going on, and it's an attractive idea, and I don't really understand. I mean, I play with those concepts of chaos and order. And through me, I harmonize them through play and through care, I guess I would say. So care being the rooting of myself into serving others and building other people up, and attenuating myself to just being in an attenuation with other people, which I learned primarily by working with children. I worked with children for a really long time. I worked in preschool for a really long time, and I had to really be attuned, almost kind of like a mother is attuned to the child, because I was working with very young children, and children that their whole being would fill with chaos, or be nap time and they'd be screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming, and there's nothing I could say or do necessarily to stop them from being in that chaotic state. But if I became very, very quiet, spontaneous peace would happen, and that spontaneous, like kind of an order would happen. But I had to not do it intentionally. I had to become bigger. I had to become not a will or an intention. I had to become a room and a container. And then within that container, I could provide a place for that child's chaos to kind of leak out of itself, or leak out of her or him, or children. I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, the whole chaos and order, those are like playing chips. It plays like a game, so we can tell stories about the relationship between chaos and order, good and evil and stuff like that, but they always kind of have to serve a story before they can serve a moral or a meaning. They always have to serve like an anecdote before they get turned into some sort of principle or law or philosophy, in my humble opinion. But I'm a storyteller, so I'm very biased towards story and meaning-making process.
And this is it's a thread that runs that runs deeply through human civilization. This tension between order and chaos. In addition to thinking about the biblical story of creation, it reminds me very much of kind of like the ancient Greek and Roman story of creation, right? When I believe that and I don't remember who exactly has created this, but I know that in the beginning, kind of like the two great beings are like the Mother Earth and the Father Sky, and this kind of like roiling chaos of the ocean. And there's a point at this, and this would be much better if I had, read my Edith Hamilton more recently and could remember the names of any of these characters, right? Yeah. But I believe it's, there's a moment in which, the character that is, the Sky is cut apart, and his member, right, is thrown into the sea, right? And out of the sea, start to emerge all of these kind of like mythical beings who later create order. And again, it's this relationship where it's like there has to be like an active kind of like, I use masculine in the most broadest sense. Force has to kind of like act upon chaos to bring out order. Is kind of this like recurring theme. And this is something that, Evola, who's a kooky, sex magic fascist, talks about quite a bit. Yeah. But nonetheless, it is just an interesting kind of, I don't know who would say it, like motif in human thought.
Yeah, I was, so I worked in preschool and I wanted to be a writer. So what I did was write and work in preschool. And one story that I really wanted to write, I wanted to rewrite the Bible. I was just fascinated. My dad's a pastor. I grew up with the Bible, and I have a problem with the Bible itself as an authoritative text. But if I treat it as a dialogue, if I can be creative with it, then it really is very important to me as a dialogue. So I'm in dialogue with this text, creative dialogue with this text. So, and by rewrite the Bible, I do not mean to make another holy text, but to wrestle and to think through the ideas, using it as a form, using it as a prompt, using it as a cache of material that I'm living through. And I tried over and over and over again to rewrite Genesis, or not rewrite Genesis, but I just wanted to tell a story about a son of Adam that wasn't Cain or Abel. I just had this vision of this man who was right there when Adam and Eve were there, and instead of being this man being offered the choice between returning to heaven when he was done with the world or building his own heaven, and just watching this man, the willful son of Adam, become the God maker. And I worked really hard to get this, but I was too immature, and I wasn't able to really just get the simplicity of language and really get into that form, that genre of writing. And I remember the iPhone had just came out, and I got this little text application. And so I had this very small screen, and I was working at a preschool. So what I would do is I would just walk around the preschool playground while the kids were playing, and I'd be watching the kids, and I would just think of a sentence and write it down. And I bring this up because the kids that I was working at, 2, 3, 4, 5, they were like those titans, right? Their emotions were really huge, and the world was really big to them. And they're just kind of thrown into the world and not really refined. They're just these huge things. They're very small packages, but very big personalities, very coarse. Everything was primary colors. And being in that mindset, or engaging with that mindset, allowed me to work on that level of myth making or meaning making through myth that is kind of like that OS, or like the very root of a societal OS operating system, like which would be a mythology or would be a storytelling. And just like the Greeks and the Romans and the biblical tradition and any tradition at all, it always starts out with children's stories. All of these very beginning myths, they're very simple stories. And then over the course of time, they get more mature, and the characters themselves get more and more complex. but there's a through line there, and what you're bringing up to me is something that I've seen in my own life, where I do go through stages of growth where something has to die before I get to the next stage. Whether it's puberty, which is the death of childhood, and then I get to be pubescent, and then I get quashed by the world, and I don't kill myself, so I'm a little bit more mature. But like every advancement in my own maturity has usually come with some sort of death, or with some sort of reckoning with my own powerlessness, and then a vacating of my powerlessness or my belief or my will, and then rediscovering that in me. And then I get to go on and rebuild myself or re-engage with the world anew.
And this is an idea you see reflected in the concept of a blood sacrifice, right? So obviously this is the central image in the Christian religion. It was, central to kind of like Old Testament Judaism. And then in many other civilizations as well, right? You see this very much in Mesoamerican civilizations. The idea that in order to be renewed, in order to be, declared blameless by God, in order for, kind of the gods of, ancient creation to be appealed, something must die. Something must be kind of given up in exchange for that. And it's sort of, you even see this in the way that, the food chain works, right? That in order for energy to go up the food chain, right, there has to be death. And so it's this sort of, on one hand, you could view that as entropic, right? There is some sort of death, but it's a regenerative form of death. Right? Like as you go higher up the food chain, organisms become more complicated, more advanced. And so in kind of a perverse way, they almost require more death to operate. Like you could sort of, and this is a little bit of a ghoulish way to look at it, but you could sort of see this kind of like measuring how advanced the civilization or a person is by how much death is required to sustain them.
Oh, wow.
And in a weird way, it's sort of the dark promise of, like a pact with the devil. You make a human sacrifice and you'll be able to transcend humanity, like give up a little bit more, use a little bit more. And to me, this reminds me very much of, an analogy that I've sort of come to when it comes to the way that, a certain form of liberal or progressivism has attacked the social order, right? If you're familiar with the concept of nuclear fission, right? You're pulling apart a bond, you're pulling apart an atom. And when you do that, there's a tremendous amount of energy released, right? There's an explosion, a bright flash. You can use it to power a submarine, all these wonderful things. Mm-hmm. But once it's broken, you can't put it back together. At least we can't now. Maybe you could in the future, but it requires a lot of energy to do that. And also, you're left with poison afterwards. And so, when I look at where we are, when I look at the woke movement, whatever you want to call it, to me, it feels like we're sitting in a crater and we've already pulled apart a whole bunch of atoms. And we've got a lot of power from that. We got a burst of power. We got a burst of production from breaking down, feudal relations. Then we got one from expanding the franchise, allowing women to vote, putting women in, and all of these things. I'm not going to deny they gave us wonderful things. But the problem is we're now sitting in a hole full of broken social bonds, surrounded by this kind of like toxic radioactive sea of resentment from pulling those apart. And we sort of are kind of like the victim of our own explosive entropy. The thing that brought us up to this height, Icarus's wings are sort of starting to melt. And that doesn't mean that it's Mad Max in the next 10 years, but it does mean that it sort of seems like there's less energy left in the system. Yeah. And we need a whole lot of energy to kind of put the pieces back together. Do you follow me through there?
Yeah. That's really interesting. You look at that race for the next rights movement and how it inherently gets more and more degenerate, where, love it or hate it, gay marriage was a thing to fight for. Nobody wanted it. The cathedral, whoever pushed it through. Everybody changed their minds about marriage. But what's marriage now? What does marriage mean now? What does fatherhood and motherhood mean now? Like, just get a surrogate. Wait, what? Oh, what does man or woman mean now? You can just change it at will. And those are rights. Like that is that releasing that that energy. And you see in the last week all these college kids protesting trans rights or human rights, and what James Lindsay says, trans violence is violence, right? They're walking around like showing all their will to violence, even though you would think that would be the last thing that anybody would want to see for them from a PR level, but they're being completely covered for it because it follows on the heels of all that. And one wonders, I've been thinking about that progressive end goal of like having the cake and eating it too. What you're talking about, the more death, it takes more and more death for us to live in a more advanced state. And yet with this whole green revolution, they want us to somehow turn into Avatar, right? They want us to somehow at once be completely liberated and yet completely tribal in nature, completely naked and yet completely self-willed and divorced from nature, completely in tune with nature and yet completely masters of nature in this really perverted way where the concepts of harmony are absent, really absent. So when I try to think, well, what is the solution? I do a lot of work right now. One of my biggest ongoing series right now is interviews with detransitioners, and a lot of just young men and women who got suckered by gender ideology, who got suckered by the promise of we can make you who you really are, and got mutilated in the process and now are coming to terms. And just story after story of these young people waking up in the middle of the night, looking at their chest or looking at their genitals and a voice coming to them. This is a frequent thing. A voice tells them, stop living a lie. Stop living a lie. And then they have to go on a journey of self-acceptance and then going through all that regret and a lot of forgiveness to catch up with that. And they gain a lot of soul and wisdom through that process. I don't think it's worth it. Their losses are greater than their gains in a certain respect, but they come out the other side. Some of the most honest people and some of the most clear-headed people and some of the most, like they earn the right to judge something as wrong, right? And there's something about, I'm going on a tangent here, but there's something about liberalism or progressivism where we're kind of ultimately trying to escape commandment or wrongness. We're trying to escape sin. We're trying to escape all bounds. And so we're trying to escape judgment. And it pops up in perverted ways because we're trying to escape it in so many ways. And the people who go through and are able to master that, are usually the people who get bit the hardest and survive.
So the trans issue is one that I found quite interesting, right? Because going back to kind of like the relationship between, God and man, right? That God is the creative force, and we are like God, and that we have kind of a fragment of that creative force. And one of the primary lessons to be taken from both Lewis and Tolkien, right, two men who are in dialogue with one another, is the idea that evil cannot create, it can pervert. So Lewis attacks this very directly when he has a section, I think in Mere Christianity, on why he's not a dualist. And his dualist, not as in someone who fights a duel, but someone who believes in, equivalent.
Would have been cool, though.
Equivalent, and yeah, that would have been cool. Equivalent and opposite forces of evil and good. Yeah. And his point is essentially that that's not how the world works, right? We know that evil is not the same thing as good. It's kind of a bastardized version. And he uses the example of like, imagine in your head, the most vile, murder, rapist, thief you can. Why does he do those things? Does he do those things, because he has some kind of high conception of what grand evil is, or because he has a perverted good desire, right? Like the desire for, shall we say, like sexual fulfillment and reproduction, which has a healthy version of it.
Yeah.
That's what he does. And this is an idea that Tolkien expresses in fiction.
Excuse me.
And in Tolkien, right, how do the forces of evil, right, Sauron's armies work? Do they create new beings out of nothing?
Yeah. No.
They corrupt. They corrupt the elf. They corrupt the human. They corrupt the dwarf into kind of perverse, twisted versions of something good. And so to me, right, and I do have a point in this, I'm not just rambling.
No.
That the image of someone who has kind of, mutilated themselves to become a facsimile of something good, right? The form of a man or the form of a woman.
Yeah.
And I genuinely feel a great deal of sympathy, because to a certain extent, they have bought the lie harder than anyone else has. They have gone through, they have committed the right. They have gone through that sacrifice.
Yeah.
And instead of being left with, transcendence, instead of being left with, a connection to something greater than themselves, it's that scene you described. Someone sitting there, looking down at themselves and realizing, well, what the hell have I done?
Yeah.
And again, it's why, like, I can't muster but so much, I don't want to say hatred, but so much disdain for these people, because, to be honest, like, they got lied to. They were told that this was the thing that would fix them. And they were people who had problems. And instead, far from it, it seems to have kind of immiserated them all. And sorry, again, I believe I'm taking up all the air in the room, but it is kind of a connection I was drawing.
Not at all. And that's why I brought up that issue, to connect with something you made me think, and I'm not being as articulate as I want to be, but when I think about how to combat entropy, and just trying to find one little place where I can combat entropy, right? So one thing that I learned from Evergreen State College and then from 2020 is that you are screwed if you think in terms of saving the world. Don't ever save the world. Don't ever save the world. You might be able to inject some order into a portion of the world if you figure out how to do that. So, you're human, so try to take on things that are human size. And just within studying the transgender phenomenon, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. There's the medical, there's the historical, there's the ideological, and then there's the whole cathedral thing, and why the transhumanism thing, and why it seems like that's the next thing. There's all these different layers of analysis, but ultimately down at the root of there is just there's human beings. There's human beings that are seeking fulfillment. They're seeking the good. They're seeking the good. And all the doctors who are doing this, they're seeking the good. I mean, they're deluded. The doctors, I have very little sympathy for. The medical organizations, I have very little sympathy for. These people are the handmaidens of evil, if such a thing as evil exists. But I can't go into it by, I can criticize the ideologues, right? Or I can bitch about people on Twitter, and I can do the Matt Walsh thing, and God bless his soul, the Daily Wire thing, and do the ideological battle left-right thing. But I don't think that is the good that is something accomplishable or meaningful to me. It's the good that's in the human being. So studying why this thing happened, and then giving a place for the people who have suffered through this and come out the other side of it, and connecting them to the humanity that was lost in that process. So there's more things than just good and evil going on. There are these other kind of, there's a spectrum of things, like care, whatever mental health is, like just a sense of reality. And in a godless world, or at least in a world without the language of God, you have to kind of do some extra tricks, but it's possible to begin to participate in somebody's opening up to their own beauty, which they had lost and ran away from, and the truth of themselves that was obscured, and the goodness that they sought, but had sought so in the wrong way. And again, like that, I can't really do anything intentionally, but just like putting a kid to sleep, when a kid doesn't want to sleep, the kid doesn't want to sleep. But if I become bigger than the kid, if again, like back to fasting, if I become the space where grace can take root, that is the best service that I could be. If I become more of a vessel than an actor in fixing the world, or in participating in the redemption of the world, maybe we can use that term, the best way for me to do that is to get myself out of the way, right? And participating in getting myself out of the way actually helps me to be a better person over time. It takes a while, but like I've seen that. And so So I still resist the whole good and evil thing. I really resist that in my bones because again, they're tokens that we can play with, but they have to serve some sort of creative process, right? So trying to make it human and trying to put it, contextualize it and anecdotes, I feel more comfortable with. But I do, and I resist good and evil because I'm so attracted to that way of thinking myself.
So this is interesting because for me, and this goes back to kind of the very, beginning of this conversation, where to me, I was convinced of the existence of evil, kind of in an abstract sense from a young age, right? I come from a Calvinist tradition, and that's very much kind of steeped in the essential corruption of man, right? So I'll admit that previous bias.
Yeah.
But to me, the moment I made that shift from, my enemies are mistaken, and don't get me wrong, I believe there are many who are mistaken, to there are evil people who wish me harm, was 2020. And there were several things about it where there were kind of moments of needless spite, right? Moments where it was, I don't just want to win, I want to ruin it.
Yeah, I want to destroy, yeah.
And to me, that kind of spite, that idea of like, I don't care if I win so long as you lose. I don't know what else you call that kind of reckless hate other than evil. Because don't get me wrong, there are disagreements. You and I might say, I think that, this is a good definition of evil. You might say that. And that's a disagreement among friends. And there are even more serious disagreements, like, oh, well, how ought a society to be ordered? But then there is, essentially like, well, I have decided to destroy you. I've decided, and this is, paraphrased Sam Hyde quote, like they want you dead, they want your kid sterilized, and they think it's funny. And that's hyperbole. That's a comedian saying it. But to me, right, and I don't want to be overly, wrapped up in the headlines, but when I see the reaction to something like what happened in Nashville, it's like, to me that feels evil. And I realize I'm a little bit of an absolutist by temperament, but to me, I don't know what else to call that.
Yeah. I mean, my origin story, but after Evergreen, after the destruction, after the explosion of entropic entropy happened at Evergreen, I was on the campus, and it was a Sunday, so hardly anybody was on the campus, and I felt palpable evil on the campus. I felt palpable darkness. The place was dark. And then like 6 months later, I decided to go back to campus. I hadn't been on campus for many months. I decided to go for a talk where somebody wanted to end free speech, some sort of like constitutional, they invited somebody, a constitutional lawyer, to argue against free speech. It was hilarious. But before I go there, I had this dream that I was on campus and that there was this rift in the world where the campus was, and there was just darkness pouring out of it, and they had gone and tried to paint everything white over it, but that darkness was just seeping out as fumes. So yes, there are very dark things. There are very low forces in the world. I am not capable of confronting those things, and I'm not capable of confronting the big darknesses. And yes, they do exist. I have a conception of them that they come from disorder, like they come from the lack of order, right? So when I view perversity on the internet, when I view these various different perversities, I can get very affected and I can get very afraid of them, or I can get very disturbed from them, but I can also see them as the lack of order, right? So I guess it's a very semantic discussion at this point, but even you said that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's still the lack of order. So how do we combat that? There are times when force is necessary. And there are times when society just gets swallowed up by evil, but ultimately that stuff cannot sustain itself. The people who are marching in the streets, looking at all these protests for, we're queer and we're going to fuck you up. That's what the sign says. Sorry to cuss on your channel.
No, not at all.
You say, well, they're mutilating themselves. And the only way that they can get more followers is to mutilate other people and to get other people in their cult. But it's death. It's death with pink hair. It can't possibly, it can do a lot of damage before it's done, right? So it does have to be stopped somehow, but inherently it doesn't, the answer is gotta be, I don't know if you can confront it directly. I mean, some people will confront it directly and some people are gifted at confronting that directly, but there's also the way of indirectly showing that there's better ways to be. There's better discussions to be had. There's more fuller and richer and more beautiful lives to be had. You persuade people that there's this greener pasture over here. And then you kind of say, okay, well, actually you have to grow the fuck up. I'm sorry. You have to work. You can't escape reality anymore. You kind of have to bait and switch. You have to do a Mott and Bailey, things are over here. Things are great over here, but you actually have to till the soil and deal with the rocks and deal with childbirth and deal with responsibility and actually see that man and woman aren't social constructs. They're social contracts. And a man is not just a small gamete producer. He's actually there's a wealth of literature and social custom that actually lifts a man out of his merely biological state. And the same with a woman. A woman is not just a biological category, but we're going to actually have to enter into that conversation of that we over the course of the last 150 years with just the gender topic. We've destroyed the definition of man and woman, and now we're left with body parts. And to get back into that, we have to re-embrace gender. That's one of my controversial statements, being somebody who speaks with a lot of feminists. I'm like, you guys want to stop this, but you were totally okay with it until it crossed this one little line. But you're pushing this boulder all the way up to this line. So getting the boulder back, it's a process of convincing people that there's a better way and then actually reinstituting values and virtues, which are not easy to come by, and inspiring people to do that. And then hopefully you have men and women, especially young men and young women, start to participate in projects of virtuousness that actually kind of get addicted to it in a way, kind of fall in love with that in a way. And then it might be a pendulum swing in the other direction where there's too much order and it gets a little either fashy or fundamentalisty. We can't stop that from happening, but...
So one of the things, and this ties back to something else we've brought up, but there's a French reactionary thinker, de Maistre, and he was writing immediately after, the French Revolution. And this is an idea that we kind of mentioned earlier with the idea of sacrifice. And he's like, how do you clear corruption? He's like, we either have to, the only way to wash it away is blood, right? You have to pay for it. There's no easy way out of it. And I, obviously you can take that in a kind of, like jackbooted, crystal knocked direction, which is not the direction I want to go by any means.
Okay.
But it is this idea that there is a tab being run up and it sort of, must be paid. And again, it's that core idea behind the sacrifice, that you have to give something up. And to me, I'm not the biggest baby boomer basher, to use an awfully illiterate phrase. But, that idea that we could create a society of limitless wealth without work, a free love, of easy divorce, the stock market would go up forever. Your house would be worth $1 million and you could retire at 62 and work on a Stingray Corvette in the garage. We burned a whole lot of capital financing that, right? Taking a mortgage out. And I think that we're starting to kind of look around and I believe you're a millennial, right? Maybe you're a Gen Xer. I don't know exactly how old you are, but you had less prosperity by all likelihood than someone, one or two generations before.
No, I'm a Gen X, so I'm not quite in the millennial mindset.
Oh, well, that's why you make so much sense, right? You're a Gen Xer. But there is this idea that like, when you kind of, when you sort of mortgage, you get a huge advantage, but that payment comes due. And so I'm not necessarily sure if we get out of this easily. I think we're going to have to pay for it. And maybe that pay for it is just like the economy takes a dive and we spend a few years in the Great Depression round two, and we come out a little bit thinner and hardier on the other side. Who knows?
Yeah. Well,
but I do think that there is this kind of nature to reality that, you will return to the mean. And I think that we're in one way or another due for that.
are you saying first world problems deserve third world solutions?
That's a good turn of phrase. I might borrow that one.